She thought marriage was a sanctuary. It was a prison with no bars, like only silence, fear, and a man who knew exactly how to break a woman without leaving marks. He thought power was everything. Then he watched her flinch at the sound of her own husband's voice, and something in him that had been dead for years cracked open. This is the story of a woman who forgot she had a spine, and a mafia boss who reminded her what it felt like to breathe. If this story hits you somewhere real, hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because it's only just beginning. The dinner was already cold by the time Graham walked through the door. Elara had timed it perfectly, or she thought she had. Chicken marsala, his favorite, pulled from the oven at 7:45 because he always said he'd be home by 8. She'd set the table the way he liked it, cloth napkins folded into neat triangles, candles lit, the good wine already breathing in the decanter. She'd even changed out of the paint-stained shirt she'd been wearing all afternoon and put on the blue dress he'd once called elegant. Before elegant stopped being a compliment and started being a reminder of everything she wasn't doing right. He walked in at 9:17. He didn't apologize. He never apologized. He dropped his coat over the back of the chair she'd draped a throw blanket on, specifically so he wouldn't do that. And he looked at the table the way a man looks at something that has already failed him. "It's cold," he said. "I can heat it up. Don't bother." She stood in the kitchen doorway with her hands clasped in front of her stomach, a habit she'd developed without realizing it, arms folded inward, body folded inward, everything curling toward the center like a plant that had stopped reaching for light. Graham poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and sat at the table anyway, and he stared at the candles like they personally offended him. "How was the meeting?" she asked. "Fine." "Did the Hargrove deal go through?" He looked at her then. Not with anger, with something worse. A flat, measuring look, like a man deciding whether a question was worth the energy of answering. "Why would you ask about that?" "I was just... You don't know anything about that deal, Elara. You don't know anything about what I do." She pressed her lips together and nodded once and went back to the kitchen to wrap the food in foil she would throw away tomorrow, because he would never eat leftovers. She stood at the counter with her back to him, and she breathed very carefully, the way she'd learned to breathe, through the nose, slow, measured, because if she breathed too fast she might cry, and crying made things worse. Crying was weakness, and Graham had very specific opinions about weakness. She had married him 6 years ago in a courthouse ceremony with 20 people and champagne that tasted like something good beginning. She had been 28, and she had been working at a small design firm downtown, and she had thought he was the most decisive, confident man she'd ever met. He always knew what to order at restaurants. He never second-guessed himself. He walked into rooms like he owned them, and back then that had felt like safety. It took her 3 years to understand that what she'd mistaken for confidence was control, and what she'd mistaken for safety was a cage being built 1 bar at a time. She didn't notice while it was happening. That was the part that still made her feel sick when she thought about it. How long she didn't notice. How he'd slowly peeled away her friendships by making her feel guilty for time spent away from home. How he'd made comments about her work until she started believing they were true. That her ideas were derivative. That her instincts were mediocre. That the only reason she'd gotten her job was luck and nothing more. How the world outside their penthouse had gradually stopped feeling like something she belonged to. By the time she understood what was happening, she had already become someone she didn't recognize. She turned off the kitchen light and walked to the living room and sat in the corner of the couch and picked up her book. She didn't read it. She stared at the same paragraph for 11 minutes while Graham drank his scotch and ignored her, and the candles burned down on a table where cold chicken marsala was going to waste. That was 6 years of marriage condensed into a Tuesday evening. She remembered when the cracks first started showing clearly enough that she couldn't explain them away. It had been 8 months ago. A charity gala for some pediatric research foundation. One of the events Graham attended not out of generosity, but because the right people would see him there, and the right people seeing him there was worth more than the check he wrote. She'd worn a black dress and done her hair, and stood at his elbow for 2 hours while he talked to men she didn't know about money. She didn't understand. She'd gone to get a glass of water, and she hadn't been watching where she was going. She'd walked directly into a man's chest. The collision was hard enough that she stumbled backward, and the water sloshed down the front of her dress, and she made a sound, a small, involuntary sound, half embarrassment and half the flinch that had become her default response to anything sudden. She grabbed for something to steady herself and found a forearm instead, a forearm that was already there, already reaching to catch her before she fell. "Easy," the man said. She looked up. He was tall. Not in the way that announces itself loudly, but in the quiet way of someone who takes up exactly the space they're supposed to take up, and no more. Dark suit, no tie. The collar of his shirt open at the throat. Dark hair with the beginning of silver at the temples. A face that had been handsome once and had grown into something more interesting. Harder lines, a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, eyes that were a shade of gray she couldn't immediately name. He was looking at her with an expression that was impossible to read. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, automatically. The reflex of a woman who had apologized so many times for so many things that sorry had lost all meaning and become just a sound she made to fill space. "I wasn't watching. I'm sorry. Let me—" "You don't have to apologize," he said. His voice was low, not soft. Low. The way the floor of a room is low. Something you stand on and trust without thinking. He had an accent she couldn't place exactly, something Eastern European that had been worn smooth by years of American English. "Your dress," he said, nodding toward the water stain spreading across her waist. "It's fine." She was already trying to step back, to disappear the way she'd gotten good at disappearing. "I'm fine." "You're not," he said. She stopped. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a question. He said it the way a doctor states a fact, with the calm certainty of someone who has seen enough of the world to recognize something true when he sees it. And it wasn't about the dress. She understood that immediately, and she didn't understand how she understood it, only that his gray eyes were on her face and not on the water stain, and nobody had looked at her face like that in a very long time. She laughed, a small, deflecting sound. "I'm really fine." "Okay," he said. He didn't argue. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a card. No design, no company name, just a phone number printed in plain black type on white stock. And he held it out to her. "If you ever need anything," he said, "call." She took the card because refusing it felt stranger than taking it. He held her eyes for one more second, and then he walked away into the crowd, and she stood there with a water-stained dress and a card she didn't know what to do with, and the strange, unshakable feeling that the man who'd just walked away from her had seen something in 6 seconds that her own husband had stopped seeing years ago. She'd looked him up that same night, on her phone in the bathroom while Graham slept. Adrian Kovar. She'd found almost nothing. A few mentions in financial press, some Eastern European business associations, one photograph from a Vienna conference 5 years ago where he was standing at the edge of a group and looking at something outside the frame. What she did find made her feel cold in a specific way she couldn't explain. The spaces around him, the things that weren't said, the records that didn't exist, the gaps where information should have been. Those told a story louder than any headline. She'd put her phone down and told herself to forget about it. She'd kept the card. That had been 8 months ago, and she was still keeping it, tucked inside the spine of a book Graham had never once touched, her own private geography of desperation. The book was on her lap right now. She was staring at that same paragraph. In the living room, Graham poured a second scotch and turned on the television, and the sound of it filled the apartment the way his silences filled rooms, completely, leaving no space for anything else. She went to bed before he did, which was the only choice she had that still felt like a choice. She lay in the dark and she didn't sleep. She had not slept well in 3 years. The morning came gray and thin, and Alara was up before 6 because she liked the apartment when it was quiet, when it was still hers in some small way. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen island with her sketchbook, the one Graham didn't know about, the one she kept in the bag she carried to the coffee shop on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the only 2 mornings a week she had that felt like she was still someone with an interior life. She drew the way she used to draw, loose, instinctive, not for a client or a brief, just shapes, just her hand moving on paper. It was the only thing that still connected her to the woman she'd been before. She heard him moving in the bedroom at 7:30, the particular sound of his morning routine, the shower, the drawers opening and closing in a specific order, the 10 minutes of silence that meant he was standing in front of the mirror deciding how to present himself to the world. She closed the sketchbook and put it away and made him coffee and had it ready on the counter before he appeared. He picked it up without acknowledging her. "I have a dinner tonight," he said. "Don't wait up." "Okay." He left at 8 without touching her. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment after the door closed, and then she exhaled, the full exhale, the one she couldn't do when he was in the room. And she picked up her own coffee, and she thought, very clearly and for the first time without flinching away from the thought, "I have to leave him. Not someday. Not when the moment is right. Not after she had somewhere to go or a plan or enough money saved in the account he didn't monitor. Soon." The thought scared her more than staying did, which told her everything she needed to know about how far gone she was. She called Tessa that afternoon. Tessa Marlowe had been Alara's best friend since their second year of college. The kind of friendship built on late nights and honesty and the specific intimacy of two people who've seen each other fall apart and helped each other put it back together. Graham had spent years trying to quietly dismantle it. He'd never said don't talk to Tessa, but he'd perfected the art of making Alara feel guilty for the time she spent away, for the phone calls he'd walk in on and stare at until she wrapped them up, for the friendship that existed outside his control. Tessa had felt him doing it and called it out once, directly. And Alara had defended Graham and then spent 3 days feeling sick about it. She hadn't told Tessa the truth, not the full truth, not yet. She met her at a cafe 9 blocks from the apartment. Close enough that it wasn't suspicious, far enough that Graham's usual routes didn't cross it. She'd checked. She'd started checking things like that. They sat in the back corner and Tessa knew immediately that something was different. Tessa always knew. She'd ordered them both coffee and she'd watched Alara sit down and she'd waited, and Alara had stared at the table for a long moment and then looked up and said, "I'm leaving him." Tessa didn't look surprised. She looked like a woman who had been waiting a long time to hear those specific words and who felt enormous relief and enormous grief simultaneously, and who was smart enough not to say "I told you so." "Okay," Tessa said. "Tell me what you need." That was when Alara started talking. She told her things she hadn't said out loud before. Not the worst of it. There was no hitting, no bruises she could point to, nothing that would look clean and legible to someone who needed proof, but the rest of it. The frozen silences. The constant evaluation. The way he made her feel stupid for her own thoughts. The way she'd stopped trusting her own instincts because he'd spent years quietly, methodically undermining every judgment she made. The fear that lived in her chest all the time now. Not fear of something specific, just the ambient, constant hum of existing in a space where she never knew what version of him she'd be managing. She told Tessa about how she'd woken up one morning and looked in the bathroom mirror and genuinely not recognized herself. Tessa listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Alara was done, she reached across the table and took her hand. "We're going to get you out," Tessa said. "I have a friend who's a family attorney. She's good. She's handled cases like this. He controls the accounts. We'll document everything. There are ways around that. He'll find out, not if we're careful." They talked for 2 hours. Practical things. What Alara had access to, what she didn't, what documentation would matter, what a timeline looked like. Tessa took notes on her phone and kept her voice low and steady, and by the time they walked out of that cafe, Alara felt something she hadn't felt in years. The fragile, terrifying sensation of momentum. She was careful on the way home. She deleted the call history. She made sure she was back before he could check. She was learning to move through her own life like an operative, quiet and invisible, leaving no trace. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Graham already knew. He'd had her phone mirrored for 4 months. Every call, every text, every search query on her browser, delivered silently to an application on his laptop that he checked the way some men check the market, regularly, dispassionately, with the practiced calm of someone who believes that information is the only real currency. He didn't confront her that night. He came home and ate dinner and watched television and went to bed, and he lay in the dark beside her with his eyes open, and he made decisions about what he was going to do about this problem the way he made all his decisions, methodically, without emotion, with the particular coldness of a man who had spent his entire adult life making sure he was never the one who lost. Alara didn't know any of this. She fell asleep that night for the first time in weeks with something like hope warming the space behind her sternum. 3 days later, she came home and tried to access their joint savings account and found it frozen. She stood at the kitchen counter with her laptop open and the words "account access restricted" on the screen, and she felt the hope drain out of her the way blood drains. Quickly, then all at once. She checked the other account, the emergency credit card, each one locked or canceled or transferred. Every financial thread she'd thought she could pull at, gone. She sat down on the kitchen floor because her legs stopped working properly. She sat on the cold tile and she breathed through it, and she thought very clearly that she was looking at the move of a man who knew exactly what she'd been planning and had decided to take the board away. Graham came home 2 hours later and made no mention of it. He asked what was for dinner, and she told him, and they ate together. And he talked about something at work, and she said the right words at the right times. And she watched his face across the table, and she understood, for the first time, the full architecture of what she was trapped inside. This was not a marriage anymore. This was a demonstration of ownership. She couldn't call Tessa from home. She waited until the next morning, until he was gone, and then she used the phone the way she'd started using it, carefully, consciously, in a way that assumed she was being watched. But Tessa's attorney friend had anticipated something like this. There were options, she said. It would take time. It would require documentation. It would require Alara to remain calm and strategic for a period of weeks, maybe longer. Weeks felt impossible. She spent 4 days trying to feel her way through it. She went through the motions of her life, the dinners, the silences, the careful navigation of Graham's moods, and underneath all of it, she was moving, very quietly, gathering documents. Bank statements she'd printed months ago and hidden. Records of financial decisions made without her input, a log she'd been keeping, dates, incidents, language used, the slow, incremental paper trail of a marriage that had become something dangerous. She kept it all in a bag, in the closet, behind winter coats Graham never touched. On the 5th day, she came home from a grocery run and found the bag on the bed. Graham was sitting in the chair by the window. He wasn't reading, he wasn't on his phone. He was just sitting in the chair with his hands folded in his lap, and the bag on the bed, between them, and the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting. She stopped in the doorway. "I was going to make dinner," she said. "Sit down, Alara." She didn't sit down. She stood in the doorway with the grocery bags in her hands because she understood on an animal level that sitting down was wrong, that putting down the grocery bags was wrong, that the only thing she wanted was to keep something solid between herself and that stillness. "Where did you get this?" she asked, nodding at the bag. "Where did I—" He stopped. He almost smiled. Almost. "It's in our closet. It's personal. He stood up. She didn't back up, but her body wanted to. Every nerve in her wanted to move away from the deliberate, measured way he crossed the room toward her. "You've been talking to a lawyer," he said. "Graham, you've been meeting with Tessa. You've been building a case." He said case like it was a word for something almost cute, like a child's project, like something she'd constructed in crayon. "Against me. I want out," she said. The words came out quieter than she meant them to, but steadier. "I want a divorce. He grabbed her wrist, not violently, not explosively. That was the thing about Graham. The violence was always in the economy of the gesture, in the precision. He took her wrist between his fingers and thumb, and he applied just enough pressure to make the bones feel fragile. And he looked at her the way he always looked at her when he wanted her to understand the limits of the world she lived in. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "You have nothing. You are nothing outside of what I've given you. Every connection you have, every opportunity. It runs through me. If you try to leave, I will make sure you walk out of this marriage with exactly what you brought into it, which is nothing. Do you understand me?" She didn't answer. He released her wrist. He walked back to this chair and sat down and picked up his phone like the conversation was over, because for him it was, he'd stated the terms, and the terms were final, and that was all there was to it. Alara put the groceries on the counter, and she did not cry. She made dinner, and they ate it in silence, and she washed the dishes, and she went to the bedroom, and she sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap, and she looked at the wall, and she stayed very, very still inside. The way you stay still when you're standing at the edge of something you can't see the bottom of. She waited until she could hear his breathing deepen in the other room. He'd fallen asleep on the couch. He did that sometimes. And then she reached under the mattress on her side, and she pulled out the book she kept there, and she opened it to the spine, and she looked at the small white card tucked there. A phone number, plain black type, 8 months old. She sat with it in her hands for a long time. Her wrist throbbed where he'd held it. The apartment was silent around her. The city was 30 floors below. She could see lights through the window, thousands of them. All those lives being lived out there in the dark. She picked up her phone. She typed the number. She wrote 3 words. I need help. She stared at it for 60 seconds with her thumb over the send button and her heart hitting her ribs with a force that felt like it might break something. Then she pressed send and put the phone face down on the mattress and sat in the dark and waited for the silence to answer. It answered in 11 seconds. The phone lit up. She turned it over. 1 message. No greeting, no name. Tell me where you are. She exhaled. The sound she made was ragged and soft and entirely involuntary. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, just a sound a person makes when they've been holding their breath for 3 years and something finally gives. She typed her address with the hands that weren't quite steady. The response was immediate. Don't move. Don't pack. Don't tell anyone. I'm 20 minutes out. She read it twice. Then she looked around the bedroom, at the life she'd built and rebuilt and been dismantled inside of. And she turned off the light, and she sat in the dark, and she waited. The 20 minutes felt like something measured in geological time. She could hear Graham breathing in the other room. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and she was very quiet and very deliberate, and she thought about nothing because thinking led to second-guessing, and second-guessing led to staying, and she was not going to stay. At 17 minutes, her phone vibrated once. Black car, side entrance, go now. She stood up. She did not pack a bag. She picked up her phone and the book with the card still in it, and she walked out of the bedroom in her socks on the hardwood floor, very quietly, past the living room where Graham was asleep on the couch with the television still on, the blue light of it moving across his face. She looked at him for 1 second, at the slack jaw and the expensive suit jacket, and the man she had loved once, and then feared and then stopped recognizing. And she kept walking. The elevator took forever. The lobby was empty. The side entrance opened onto a narrow service corridor that led out onto the street, and she pushed through the door into the October air, and it hit her face like cold water, and she gasped, actually gasped, at the shock of being outside. The black Mercedes was already there. Armored, she could tell by the way it sat heavy and low. The rear door opened before she reached it, and a man she didn't recognize, broad, expressionless, wearing a dark jacket, held it from the outside and didn't say anything. She got in. Adrian Kovar was in the other seat. He was wearing the same kind of dark suit she remembered from the gala. No tie. His gray eyes finding her immediately in the low light of the car's interior. He looked at her wrist, the one Graham had grabbed, and his jaw tightened once, and then his face went back to that unreadable stillness. "You all right?" he said. She started to say fine. The word died before it reached her mouth. "No," she said. "Not really." He nodded, like that was acceptable. Like not being fine was something a person could just say without having to qualify it or apologize for it. The car moved. The city slid past the windows. She watched Chicago disappear behind her, and she didn't look back, and she thought she should feel something enormous, grief or terror or relief. But what she actually felt was a strange, suspended quiet, like the moment between a door closing and the next thing beginning. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," he said. She looked at him in the dark interior of the car, at the scar through his eyebrow, at the hands folded in his lap, careful hands, controlled, the kind that had done things she probably didn't want to know about. "I looked you up," she said. 8 months ago. After the gala." He looked at her steadily. "I know. What are you?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of avoidance, the silence of a man choosing his words with the same care he brought to everything else. "I'm the person who's going to make sure he never touches you again," he said. "That's what I am right now. The rest of it..." He paused. "We can talk about the rest of it when you're somewhere you can breathe." She turned back to the window. The city lights were thinning. The highway opened up ahead of them, dark and wide. She didn't ask anything else. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known yet, was that Adrian Kovar had not offered her his card at that gala on impulse. He had not called her 20 minutes ago out of the kindness of an ordinary man with a good heart. The 8 months between that collision and this moment were not a gap. They were a period of the most meticulous, patient, deliberate watching she could have imagined, and what he had watched had made him decide something, not to save her. Something more complicated than that. Something that, in the morning when she was inside his compound and breathing and finally safe, was going to change every assumption she had about what she'd just walked into. The Mercedes accelerated into the dark. Behind them, in a penthouse 30 floors above Chicago, a man was waking up on a couch, with the television still playing, reaching for his phone, finding a message he didn't recognize, and beginning to understand that something had just slipped through the most sophisticated net of control he'd ever built. Graham Voss had never lost anything in his life. That was about to change. But so was everything Alara thought she knew about the man sitting 3 feet away from her in the dark. The man whose gray eyes were watching the road ahead with the fixed, calculating stillness of someone who had been planning this exact moment for a very long time. And planning, in Adrian Kovar's world, never happened without a reason. The car disappeared into the Illinois dark, and the night held its breath. The compound materialized out of the dark the way certain things do. Not gradually, but all at once, like a fact you suddenly can't unknow. They'd been driving for 40 minutes when the highway gave way to a 2-lane road, and the 2-lane road gave way to a private drive flanked by trees so old and thick they blocked out what was left of the night sky. The headlights swept across a gate, iron, 12 feet high, no ornamentation, nothing decorative about it at all. And it opened before the car slowed, which meant someone had been watching for them, which meant there were people stationed in the dark among those trees, which meant Alara had just driven into something she did not yet have the vocabulary for. She didn't say anything. The car rolled through and the gate closed behind them, and she watched it in the side mirror, and she felt the last thread connecting her to the life she'd left snap clean. The main house appeared at the end of the drive. Stone, 3 stories, the kind of architecture that had been built to last centuries and knew it. Not beautiful exactly, but solid in a way that communicated something specific about the man who lived there. Power that didn't need to announce itself. Lights burned on the ground floor and on the upper right, but the rest of the facade was dark, and there were 2 men on the front steps who were clearly not decorative. The car stopped. The man who'd opened her door before was outside again before she could reach for the handle. Adrian was already out, moving around the front of the car, and he paused at her door and looked in at her with those gray eyes, and waited. She got out. The October air was colder here than in the city. It smelled like wet leaves and distance. "This way," Adrian said. He didn't touch her. He walked beside her toward the steps, close enough that she was aware of him, but not crowding her, and the 2 men on the steps moved aside without a word or a look passing between them. Inside, the entryway was wide and spare, stone floors, high ceilings, almost no furniture in the immediate space, which felt like a deliberate choice. A woman was waiting just inside. 50s, gray hair cut short, a face that had settled into permanent efficiency. "Mrs. Karras," Adrian said, "this is Alara. She'll need a room on the 2nd floor." The woman, Mrs. Karras, looked at Alara with an expression that was not warm and not cold and not anything Alara could easily categorize. Assessment, maybe. The specific look of a person who has seen many situations and is filing this one appropriately. "Second guest room is ready," she said. "Should I bring up food?" "Please," Alara said before Adrian could answer. She hadn't eaten since noon. Mrs. Karras disappeared without further commentary. Alara stood in the entryway and looked around and then looked at Adrian, and he was already watching her in that way he had. Not staring, just watching, the way you watch something you are trying to accurately understand. "You should sleep," he said. "I don't think I can sleep." "Try anyway." He paused. "You're safe here. I need you to understand that before anything else." "I understand it intellectually." "That's enough for tonight." He showed her upstairs himself. The second guest room was large and plain, a bed with good linens, a window that looked out over the backgrounds, a bathroom with towels already folded. Nothing personal about it, no art on the walls. But it was clean, and it was quiet, and when he told her there was a lock on the door and the code for the house alarm in case she needed it, something in her chest loosened just slightly. He left her there. She sat on the edge of the bed, and she breathed. Mrs. Karras brought soup 20 minutes later. chicken broth, bread, nothing complicated, and set it on the small table by the window without ceremony and left again. Alara ate all of it. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the bowl was in front of her. And then she ate with a focus that was almost embarrassing, the specific hunger of a body that has been existing on anxiety and adrenaline for too long. She didn't sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark with her eyes open, and she listened to the compound. The occasional sound of footsteps somewhere below, the distant pulse of what might have been a generator, the very particular quiet of a place with real perimeter security, which is different from ordinary quiet, the way a held breath is different from relaxed breathing. Eventually, somewhere around 3 in the morning, her body gave out beneath her, and she went under. She slept 6 hours without dreaming. When she woke up, the room was full of gray morning light, and someone had slid a clean set of clothes under the door, jeans, a sweater, both slightly too large but clean and soft. And there was coffee on the table next to where the soup bowl had been, still warm, which meant someone had been in the room while she slept, which should have disturbed her more than it did. She showered, she dressed, she went downstairs. Adrian was in a room off the main hallway that was clearly his working space. Not a formal office, but a room that functioned like one. 2 monitors on a wide wooden desk, stacks of files that looked organized according to some system she couldn't immediately parse, a whiteboard on one wall with writing she couldn't read from the doorway. He was on the phone when she appeared, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Not French, not Spanish, something with harder consonants. And he held up one finger without looking at her and finished the call in under a minute. He set the phone down and turned to face her. "You slept," he said. "Some?" "Good." He nodded at a chair across from the desk. "Sit down. We need to talk." She sat. He didn't go back behind the desk. He sat in the other chair, the one at a right angle to hers, which felt deliberate, not across from her, not positioned above her, beside her. She noticed it. "You said last night we could talk about the rest of it," she said. "Yes." "So talk." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and he looked at her steadily, and he said, "My name is Adrian Kovar. I'm not a businessman. I run an organization, criminal in most jurisdictions, that operates across 8 countries, primarily financial infrastructure, some enforcement, some supply chain management. I won't get into specifics on. I'm not a good man in the way most people use that phrase. I want you to know that before anything else." Alara held his eyes. She'd expected it. She'd known since the internet search 8 months ago, known in the way you know something you don't want to put into words. But hearing it stated plainly, without apology or euphemism, still did something to the air in the room. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated, like he was testing the weight of it. "Why did you give me your card that night?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was deciding not whether to answer, but how. "Because I could see what was happening," he said, "to you, what kind of man you were standing next to. You met me for 45 seconds. I've spent 20 years reading people. It's not a skill, it's..." He paused. "It becomes automatic. You learn to see what people are carrying. And what was I carrying?" He looked at her directly. Someone who had spent a long time trying to convince herself she wasn't afraid. She said nothing. The accuracy of it sat in her chest like a stone. "After the gala," he continued, "I had someone look into Graham Voss." "You investigated my husband?" "Yes." "Because of one 45-second collision at a charity event. Because something about that collision bothered me for weeks, and I've learned not to ignore the things that bother me." He paused. "What we found wasn't just..." He stopped, started again more carefully. "He's not only a bad husband, Alara. The financial abuse, the psychological control, that's the part that touches you. But Graham Voss has been moving money for people who do not have clean hands. Fraud, corporate manipulation, some things that border on worse. He's built a very careful life, and beneath it he is genuinely dangerous." Alara sat with that. "That's why you watched," she said, "for 8 months. Partly. What's the other part?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was the same, low, even, but something shifted underneath it, something she couldn't entirely name. "I wanted to make sure you had somewhere to go," he said, "when you finally decided to go." She looked at him for a long moment. That sounds like you were waiting for me. I was. The honesty of it was disarming in a way she hadn't prepared for. She'd expected calculation. And there was calculation. She wasn't naive. But the directness of it, the absence of any attempt to dress it up, was something she didn't know how to respond to. She looked away first. I need to call Tessa, she said. Not yet. She looked back at him sharply. Excuse me? Graham has your phone mirrored, he said. He's had it mirrored for 4 months. Every call, every text. Your meeting with Tessa at the cafe. He knew about it within the hour. The bottom dropped out of something in her stomach. She thought about the frozen accounts, the documents on the bed, the way he'd sat in that chair without surprise, without anger, just waiting with the particular patience of a man who already knew exactly how this was going to go. He knew, she said. It wasn't a question. He knew. For 4 months. For 4 months. She stood up. She didn't have anywhere to go, but she needed to be standing. She walked to the window and looked out at the back grounds. Stone paths, bare trees, 2 men doing a perimeter walk in the far distance. And she pressed her fingertips against the cold glass and she breathed. He let me plan, she said. He let me think I had a plan, and he watched me do it. Yes, he froze the accounts to show me he could. To show you that you were only moving because he allowed you to move. She pressed her forehead against the glass for 1 second, cold, grounding. And Tessa, she said, is Tessa safe? Graham has no reason to go after Tessa directly. She's insulation for him, not a threat, but she shouldn't contact you on your old phone. I left my phone. She'd grabbed it off the mattress, but it was the mirrored phone, the compromised one, and she'd had it in her pocket the whole drive. I know, we dealt with it. She turned from the window. You dealt with it how? It's off. Isolated. He can see the last location ping, which puts you in a residential neighborhood on the north side. It'll hold for a day, maybe 2, before he starts asking different questions. She stared at him. You've done this before. Managed information, yes. Moved people. A pause. When necessary. She sat back down. Not because she felt calm, but because her legs were doing that uncertain thing again, and she didn't want him to see it. What happens now? She said. Now, I make some calls. There are people who owe me things, and some of those things involve the kind of access that will let us document what Graham has been doing in a way that a court will actually use. Your divorce attorney, Tessa's friend, she's good? Tessa said so. I'll have someone verify. If she's as good as advertised, she's going to have more ammunition than she knows what to do with inside of 2 weeks. Alara looked at him, at the scar through his eyebrow, at the stillness of a man who made these kinds of calculations the way other people made grocery lists. You're going to destroy him, she said. I'm going to make sure he can't destroy you, he said. What happens to him in the process is up to him. She wanted to ask him why. Not the surface answer. She wanted the real one, the one underneath. But she didn't ask it yet because she wasn't sure she was ready for whatever the real answer was. The day moved strangely. She had no phone, no laptop, no connection to anything outside the compound walls. Mrs. Karras fed her lunch at a kitchen table without ceremony and offered her the use of a small sitting room with books and a television, which felt almost absurd. The normalcy of it, the domestic quietness, inside a house that was clearly a command center for something far from domestic. She found a sketchbook in the sitting room, blank, new, the kind that comes in sets. And she sat for 2 hours with a pencil and she drew. Just shapes. Just the habit of her own hand. It was the only thing that felt like herself. Adrian was in and out of the house. She heard him on the phone twice more, the second time in English, clipped, direct, nothing she could catch clearly except a name she didn't recognize and the phrase before the week is out, which told her something was already in motion. In the late afternoon, she found him in the kitchen making coffee with the focused attention of a man who applies the same rigor to everything. And she sat at the island and watched him, and she said, "Tell me about the people who owe you things." He glanced at her. "That's a broad question." "Narrow it then." He poured 2 cups and set one in front of her and leaned against the counter opposite. "There are people in this city, in finance, in municipal structures, who have done business with me or through me over the years. Some of them have crossed Graham Voss professionally. Some of them know things about his operations that they've chosen not to act on because acting on them carries risk. I can reduce that risk. By doing what? By making it safer to talk than to stay quiet. That's a polite way to say coercion. It's a polite way to say leverage, he said. There's a difference. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Is there? He looked at her steadily. Coercion is when you have no choice. Leverage is when the choice I'm offering is better than the alternative. He paused. I'm not threatening anyone with physical harm, Alara. I'm giving people an opportunity to clean their hands of something dirty. Most of them will take it. She didn't know what to do with that. She'd grown up in a world where the lines between legal and illegal were clean, obvious, clearly posted. She was sitting in a man's kitchen who lived in a different geography entirely, where the lines were pragmatic rather than moral, and the unsettling thing was that she was finding his logic coherent. That frightened her more than the compound's perimeter guards did. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? She considered it honestly. Someone harder. Someone who wouldn't explain things. I explain things when it matters, he said. You matter. The directness of it, again. She looked down at her coffee. Don't do that, she said. Do what? Say things like that. Like they're just facts. They are facts. To you, maybe. Isn't that what a fact is? Something true, regardless of who finds it convenient? She looked up at him. He wasn't smiling, but there was something in his expression, some slight shift, that was the closest thing to warmth she'd seen on him yet. It made him look younger. It made him look, briefly, like a man who hadn't built every wall in himself out of necessity. She looked away before it could become something she'd have to manage. That evening, one of Adrian's men, introduced only as Reyes, compact and quiet with watchful eyes, brought her a new phone. Clean, untraceable, already programmed with 2 numbers. Adrian's. And Tessa's, which meant someone had already reached Tessa through a secure channel, which meant Tessa knew where she was, or at least knew she was safe, which meant Alara wasn't as isolated as she'd felt all day. She called Tessa from the sitting room with the door closed. Tessa picked up on the first ring. Oh, thank God, Tessa said. I'm okay, Alara said. I'm somewhere safe. Are you... Tessa stopped, recalibrated. Are you with him? The man from... Yes. A pause. Longer than comfortable. Alara, I know you needed help and I know options were limited, but do you understand who that man is? He told me himself, this morning. And you're still there. Where else would I go? Graham froze everything, Tessa. He's had my phone mirrored for 4 months. He knew about the attorney, he knew about our meetings, he knew about all of it. I had nothing left to work with. Tessa was quiet. Alara could hear her breathing, the specific rhythm of someone trying to stay calm while feeling the opposite of calm. Your attorney friend, Alara said. Is she good? Really good? She's the best I know. She's going to get a call, Alara said, from someone connected to where I am. She should take the meeting. Whatever documentation they offer, she should take it. Alara, I know what I'm doing. Do you? The question wasn't cruel. It was the question of a woman who loved her, who had watched her disappear inside a bad marriage for 3 years, and was now watching her disappear inside something potentially more complicated, and who was scared, in the specific way of someone who has no power to do anything about what they're afraid of. I think so, Alara said, which was the truest answer she had. She hung up and sat with the phone in her hands for a moment, and then she went to find Adrian. He was back in the working room. The whiteboard had more writing on it now. She still couldn't read it from the doorway, but the shape of it had changed, expanded. He was standing in front of one of the monitors with his arms crossed, and he was looking at something she couldn't see from where she stood. Rhea said you needed to see me, she said. He turned. Graham made his first move. She felt the air change. What did he do? He called the police, filed a missing person report. Adrian's voice was flat, informational. It's a smart play. Gets ahead of any narrative you might try to build, puts him in the position of concerned husband. He filed it 2 hours ago. Can he... It doesn't affect you here, but it means his timeline has accelerated, which means ours needs to as well. He turned back to the monitor. There's something else. Tell me. One of the men we'd been monitoring, a contact of Graham's, someone with significant financial documentation that implicates him, went dark this afternoon, stopped answering his phone. The last ping from his device was near Graham's office building. She stood very still. What does that mean? Adrian turned to face her fully. His expression hadn't changed, but his eyes had. Some quality in them sharpened, the way a blade edge catches light. It means Graham isn't just trying to control this situation anymore, he said. It means he's trying to eliminate it. The word eliminate sat in the room between them. The documentation, she said. If that contact is, we have copies of most of it. Not all. He paused. He's moving faster than I anticipated. He's more connected than the initial assessment suggested. Meaning what? Meaning we're in trouble? Meaning the situation has changed? He held her eyes. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Okay. In the 6 years of your marriage, did Graham ever mention the name Vasily Dragan to you? She turned the name over. No, never. Something shifted in his expression. Not fear. Adrian Kovar did not appear to experience fear in any conventional way, but a kind of recalibration, the internal adjustment of a man who has just received information that changes the shape of something he thought he understood. Who is that? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her for a long moment with that measuring gray gaze, and she had the distinct impression that he was deciding how much of the next truth she could hold. Someone I have history with, he said finally. Someone who has reasons to want certain situations destabilized. He paused. If Graham is connected to Dragan, this is no longer a domestic situation with criminal edges. This is... He stopped. She waited. This is something different, he said. Something that puts you at risk in a way I did not factor in when I made you the promise I made you. Alara stood in the doorway of the room, and she looked at the man who had pulled her out of one cage, and she understood, with a cold and absolute clarity, that she might have just walked into something considerably worse. Tell me, she said. All of it, right now. He looked at her, and before he could answer, Reyes appeared at the end of the hallway, moving fast, and said 2 words that made Adrian's entire body change, every muscle, every angle of him snapping into a different register entirely. We've got company, Reyes said. The lights on the perimeter lights died. Not all at once, in sequence, left to right along the eastern wall, each one blinking out like a thought being erased, and in the sudden dark the compound grounds became a different place entirely, full of depth and shadow and the specific threat of things you can no longer see. Adrian was already moving before the last light went. He crossed the hallway in 4 steps and took Alara by the arm. Not rough, not gentle, simply decisive, the grip of a man who does not have time for anything that isn't necessary. And he moved her away from the doorway and into the interior of the working room, away from the windows. Stay here, he said. What's happening? Someone cut the eastern grid. He was at the desk, pulling open a drawer, and what he took out of it was not a file or a phone. He checked it with the automatic efficiency of muscle memory and holstered it at his back. It's a distraction or a probe. Either way, I need to know which. Adrian, Reyes. He was already out the door, speaking to the man in the hallway in a low, rapid exchange she couldn't fully follow. Positions, sectors, words that were clearly part of a standing operational vocabulary. Reyes disappeared toward the back of the house. 2 other men materialized from somewhere, she hadn't even known they were inside, and fanned out without instruction. She stood in the working room with her hands at her sides, and she breathed through her nose and she looked at the whiteboard. She could read it now from this distance, in this proximity. Names connected by lines in dry erase marker, financial entities, arrows indicating flow. And in the upper right corner, circled twice in red, a name she recognized. Graham Voss. Connected by 2 lines to a name she'd heard 11 minutes ago for the first time. Vasily Dragan. And Dragan's name connected by a single line that had been drawn more recently, the ink slightly fresher, the line less certain, to something she needed another 3 seconds to process. A name she knew. Not from Graham's world, not from the gala or the finance press, or any of the contexts she'd been moving through since last night. From her own life. From before. She was still staring at it when Adrian came back. He read her face before she could arrange it into anything neutral. "You saw the board," he said. "Who is Marcus Hale?" she said. He was very still. "Adrian." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Marcus Hale is my brother-in-law. He's been married to my sister for 9 years. He works in corporate finance. She stopped. The line on the board was not ambiguous. The position of the name was not ambiguous. "Tell me what that line means." He closed the door behind him. That single action, the quiet, deliberate closing of the door, told her more than anything he could have said, because it meant what came next required the room to be closed, required whatever was about to happen to be contained. "Sit down," he said. "I don't want to sit down. Tell me what Marcus Hale's name is doing on that board." He looked at her for a long moment. The calculating quality in his eyes was still there, but something else had entered it. Something that looked, on a man like Adrian Kovar, almost like reluctance. "Marcus Hale is not who you think he is," he said. "Explain that." "He's been a financial intermediary for Vasily Dragon's network for approximately 6 years. He moves money through legitimate corporate structures, shell companies, real estate vehicles, investment funds. He is very good at it, and he has been very careful." Adrian paused. "He is also the person who introduced Graham Voss to Dragon's network 3 years ago." 3 years. The number landed like something physical. 3 years ago was when Graham had started pulling away, when the control had tightened, when the man she'd married had begun his most systematic dismantling of everything she was, and she had spent 3 years telling herself it was her inadequacy, her failure to be what he needed. And now she was standing in a room in a Mafia compound looking at her brother-in-law's name on a whiteboard and understanding that the architecture of her suffering had been constructed by people she knew. "My sister," she said. "We don't believe your sister has any knowledge of Marcus's activities." "You don't believe?" "Based on everything we've seen, her communications, her financial activity, her behavior, she is not involved. She is, in all probability, in the same position you were in, living inside something she doesn't have the full picture of." Ilara put her hand flat on the desk. The wood was solid under her palm. She needed that, the specific solidity of something real. "Does Marcus know I'm here?" she said. "Not yet, but if Graham is moving fast enough to approach Dragon's network for support, Marcus will know within hours, possibly sooner." She looked at the board again, at the lines, at the clean, terrible logic of it, the way her marriage and her sister's marriage and 2 criminal networks had been occupying the same geography this entire time, right beneath the surface of the ordinary life she'd been living. Birthday dinners with Marcus and Claire, Christmas, Sunday phone calls, Marcus handing Graham a glass of wine at the 4th of July gathering last summer with the comfortable familiarity of men who share something. They did share something, she just hadn't known what it was. "The man who went dark," she said. "The contact. The one who stopped answering his phone near Graham's office." "Yes." "Did Graham do that? Or did Dragon?" Adrian's jaw tightened once. "We don't know yet. But it's possible that Graham has access to resources significantly beyond what we initially assessed." "Yes." She absorbed that. The sound came from outside then. Not an explosion, not gunfire, something subtler and therefore more alarming. The crunch of gravel under tires moving slowly, without headlights, on the service road that ran along the compound's northern edge. She could hear it through the window because the compound had gone so quiet, all the ambient noise of the security systems replaced by the particular alert silence of people who were listening. Adrian was at the window in 2 strides, standing to the side of it, not in front of it. He looked out at an angle. "One vehicle," he said, stopping short of the gate. He turned from the window and picked up his phone and said 4 words into it she didn't understand and listened and then said, "Pull him in." He looked at her. "Stay in this room." "Adrian?" "Ilara." Just her name. But the way he said it, the specific weight of it, stopped her. "I will come back and tell you everything, but right now I need you to stay in this room and not move. Can you do that?" She held his eyes for 1 second. "Yes," she said. He left. She did not stay in the room. She gave him 90 seconds. She counted them, standing in the center of the working room with her arms crossed and her jaw set. And then she followed quietly, The way she'd learned to move through her own apartment without making sound, sliding along the interior hallway toward the back of the house where the voices were gathering. The back entry was a utility space. Stone floors, coat hooks, a door to the outside that was standing open. 3 of Adrian's men were there, and between them, zip-tied at the wrists and looking like a man who had made several consecutive bad decisions, was someone she'd never seen before. 30s, civilian clothes, a phone in his jacket pocket that Reyes was already going through with gloved hands. Adrian was crouched in front of him. "Who sent you?" Adrian said. The man said nothing. His breathing was fast and shallow, and there was a cut above his eyebrow that was bleeding slowly into his eye. "You drove up the service road without lights," Adrian said. "That means you knew the road was there, which means you were briefed, which means someone sent you, so. Who?" "I want a lawyer." "You're not under arrest," Adrian said. "You're on private property. The rules are different here." The man looked at the floor. Adrian reached out and picked up the phone that Reyes had extracted and looked at the screen. Something in his expression changed, a compression, a tightening around the eyes that she'd started to recognize as the external sign of something significant happening internally. He stood up. He looked at Reyes and said, "Get the number off that device and then take him to the East Room. Keep him comfortable." The last 2 words were said without irony and without threat, but they landed in the room like both. He turned and found Alara standing in the hallway doorway, and he looked at her with an expression that was not angry and was not surprised. "I told you to stay in the room," he said. "I know." He walked toward her and past her, and she followed him back down the hallway to the working room, and he closed the door again, and he turned to face her, and he held up the phone. "This device has 3 contacts," he said. "No names. Numbers only. The last outgoing call was made 40 minutes ago." He paused. "The number it called is the same number that has appeared in Graham Voss's call records 11 times in the past 2 weeks. She looked at the phone. "So Graham sent him." "Graham sent him. But look at what he was sent with." He turned the phone to show her the screen. A photograph, taken from a distance with a long lens, grainy but clear enough. The compound's front gate, taken from the tree line on the other side of the drive. Someone had been watching the compound before tonight. "They know where I am," she said. "They've known since sometime this afternoon, probably earlier." She thought about the mirrored phone, the location ping Adrian's people had spoofed, placing her on the north side. "You said the false location would hold for a day or 2. I was wrong about how quickly Graham would move. He had resources I didn't account for. Druggin's resources." Yes, she looked at him. At the phone in his hand and the whiteboard behind him, and the door that was closed but not locked, and the window that looked out onto grounds where one of Graham's people had just been found in the dark. "So what we had," she said slowly, "the plan, the documentation, the 2 weeks you said we had, the timeline has collapsed. By how much?" "We have hours," he said, not days." She took that in. "The documentation that implicates Graham," she said. "The financial records, the evidence. How much of it do we actually have? Right now, tonight, what can we prove?" He set the phone down and looked at the board. Enough to damage him. Enough to open investigations that would take years to close. "Not enough," he said, and the pause before the last part was short, but she felt it. "To guarantee that he can't retaliate effectively in the short term." Define retaliate. He looked at her. "He could go after people you care about, Tessa, your sister." He paused. "He could go after the attorney. Destroy the case before it's built." She pressed her back against the wall. The plaster was cold through the sweater. "And Druggon," she said. "Where does he fit in this? Why would someone like that care about my divorce?" "Because your divorce," Adrian said, "threatens to surface the financial structures that Graham has been running for Dragon's network. Graham goes down, those structures get scrutinized. Dragon doesn't tolerate scrutiny." He stopped. "And because Dragon knows that I'm involved now, he's known it since—" He stopped again, differently this time. She watched his face. "Since when?" she said. He turned away from her, went to the desk, picked up nothing, just moved, the restlessness of a man who needed a moment to construct something he was about to say. "Vasile Dragon and I have history," he said, to the desk rather than to her. "He was my father's business partner, 22 years ago, before my father died." The last three words were said with a flatness that indicated a story too large for this moment. Dragan and I have been in opposition for the better part of a decade. Different territories, different methods, ongoing disagreement about certain... He stopped. When he found out I was involved in extracting you from Graham's situation, this stopped being about Graham. She was very still. This is about you and Dragan, she said. This became about me and Dragan the moment his surveillance identified my vehicle outside your apartment building last night. She understood then. The full shape of it. The thing she'd walked into not by accident, not entirely, but because the man who'd handed her a card at a charity gala was already at war with the man her husband had been working for, and she had been standing in the middle of it without knowing it, a piece on a board she couldn't see. "Did you know?" she said. "When you gave me the card, did you know Graham was connected to Dragan?" He turned to face her. "No," he said. "I did not know that when I gave you the card." "When did you find out?" 6 weeks ago. She counted backward. 6 weeks ago. While she'd been planning her escape, counting documents, meeting with Tessa, telling herself she had a plan, 6 weeks ago, Adrian Kovar had discovered that her husband was embedded in the network of his most significant enemy, and he had not told her. "You kept watching," she said, "after you found out." "Yes. You knew it was more dangerous than you'd initially assessed, and you kept watching. You didn't..." She stopped, started again. "You could have warned me. 6 weeks ago you could have... And told you what? That the man you were trying to leave was running money for an Eastern European crime network? That extracting you was going to create a conflict with someone I've been at war with for 10 years? He looked at her directly. "You were already terrified. You were already paralyzed. If I'd told you that, you wouldn't have moved at all." "That was my choice to make." "Yes," he said. "It was. And I made it for you. I know that." The silence between them had weight and texture. She could feel her pulse in her wrists. Not fast exactly, but very present, very deliberate. The specific heartbeat of a person who is holding a large amount of feeling at a distance because there is no room for it right now. "So what now?" she said. Her voice was quiet. Not soft. Quiet. The way something is quiet when it's been stripped of everything unnecessary. He moved to the board. He uncapped the marker and he drew a new line. From Dragan's name down to a space he'd left blank at the bottom. And he wrote 2 words. Leverage point. "Dragan has something he values more than destabilizing me," Adrian said. "There is one piece of documentation, financial, specific, that would expose him personally, not his network. Him. The kind of exposure that jurisdictions outside his protection zones would act on." He paused. "Marcus Hale has it. He doesn't know he has it, but it's embedded in the financial architecture he built for Dragan 3 years ago. If we get to Marcus before Graham does..." Her phone buzzed. The new phone. The clean one. She looked at the screen. It was her sister, Claire Hale, calling at 11:40 at night from a number that never called late, from a sister who kept a schedule like a religion and was never awake past 10. Elara looked at Adrian. He nodded once. She answered. "Claire?" The sound on the other end was not Claire's voice. It was breathing, fast, close to the receiver, the specific breathing of someone who was trying very hard not to make any noise. And then, very quietly, barely above a whisper, her sister said, "Elara, don't talk. Just listen. Marcus came home an hour ago, and something is wrong. He's on the phone, and I can hear him, and he said your name, and he said..." A sound in the background. A door. The call cut. Elara stood with the dead phone pressed against her ear, and the room tilted slightly around the edges, and she thought, with a clarity that felt like ice water, that her sister was alone in a house with a man who was connected to people who made problems disappear, and the last sound she'd heard was a door opening, and the call was dead, and she had absolutely no way to know what was happening on the other end of that silence. She lowered the phone. She looked at Adrian. "We need to get to my sister," she said. "Right now, tonight." He was already reaching for his jacket. "I know," he said. But the way he said it, the particular flatness of it, the lack of surprise, made her look at him sharply, made her read his face with every instinct she had sharpened over 6 years of reading a dangerous man's face for information he wasn't volunteering. "You knew he'd go after her," she said. "You already knew that was the move he'd make." Adrian looked at her. And in the 2 seconds before he answered, she saw it. The fractional hesitation, the almost imperceptible adjustment of a man who is deciding how much of a truth to... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Alara looked at his face, at the fractional delay, at the way his eyes had gone to a point just past her shoulder for 1/2 second before coming back. And she understood with a cold, absolute certainty that she was looking at a man who had run the calculation and decided, at some point between last night and right now, that Claire was a contingency he'd already accounted for. "You knew," she said. "I knew it was a possibility. That is not the same thing as what I asked you." She took one step toward him. "Did you know he would go after my sister?" The pause was short. "Yes." The word hit her like something physical. She felt it in her sternum, in the back of her throat, in the specific place where trust lives before it gets destroyed. "And you didn't tell me. If I told you, you would have gone to her, alone, without any capacity to protect either of you. You would have walked directly into, 'She's my sister.'" The words came out quiet and stripped and final. "She's my sister, and you made a decision about her life without telling me, and you put her in that house with that man knowing what Marcus was—" "Alara," his voice was low, not soft, low. "We can do this later. Right now your sister needs us moving, not standing in this room." She hated that he was right. She hated the clarity of it, the way he could be wrong and right simultaneously, the way she could be furious at him and still need him in the same breath. She hated all of it, and she swallowed it, pushed it down into the same place she'd been pushing things for 6 years, except this time she knew she was doing it. And why? Which was different, which was the only thing that made it bearable. "Move," she said. They moved. The car was different this time. Not the armored Mercedes, but something lower and faster. And Reyes was driving with 2 men in the follow vehicle behind them. Adrian was on the phone before they cleared the gate, speaking fast in that same hard consonant language. And Alara sat in the back with her hands flat on her thighs and her eyes on the road ahead, and she breathed in counts of 4, the way she'd taught herself to breathe when the walls closed in. Claire lived 40 minutes from the compound on a normal night. Reyes made it 31. The house was a colonial in a quiet suburb, the kind of neighborhood where people left decorative wreaths on their doors year-round and thought the worst thing that could happen was a property tax increase. 2 cars in the driveway. The lights on in the kitchen and the living room. Everything that looked from the street like a completely normal Tuesday night. Adrian put his hand on her arm before she reached for the door handle. "Listen to me," he said. "We don't know what's inside. We don't know if Marcus is alone or if Graham has people in there with him. We go in calm. Understood?" "I'm calm." "You're furious. That's not the same thing." She looked at him. "I can be both." Something crossed his face. Not quite approval, not quite something else. He let go of her arm. "Stay behind me until I've read the room," he said. "Then you can do whatever you need to do." They went in through the side gate. Reyes had the layout on his phone, pulled from somewhere she didn't ask about, and he and one man went around the back while Adrian and Alara approached the front. Adrian knocked. Not hard. A normal knock. 15 seconds. The door opened, and it was Marcus. She'd seen him 3 weeks ago at a birthday dinner for Claire, sitting at the head of the table refilling wine glasses and laughing at his own jokes the way he always did. Broad-shouldered, conventionally handsome. The kind of man who'd been told he was charming so many times he'd built his entire personality on the foundation of it. Now he was standing in his own doorway in a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and his face was doing something complicated. The smile forming and then stalling when he saw Adrian standing beside her. The social machinery grinding against something it couldn't process. "Alara," he said, "Where's Claire?" she said. She went to bed. It's late. What is this?" His eyes went to Adrian. Something in them shifted. A flicker of recognition, quickly suppressed, quickly replaced with the performance of confusion. "Who are you?" "Someone who'd like to come inside," Adrian said. "I don't know who you are, man. I'm not just—" "Marcus." Alara stepped forward. Not aggressive, just present, close enough that he had to look at her face directly. "I talked to Claire 40 minutes ago. She called me." She was whispering, and then the call cut. So you're going to let us in, or I'm going to stand on this porch and scream her name until every light in this neighborhood comes on. Your choice. He read her face. He stepped back. The living room was immaculate the way rooms are immaculate when someone has recently and hastily straightened them. The specific too clean quality of a space that has been brought to order in the last hour. Marcus had been drinking. She could smell it from 3 feet away, the sweet sourness of scotch. Same thing Graham drank. And that detail hit her somewhere unpleasant. "Claire," she called. Nothing. "Marcus." Adrian's voice had changed register entirely. It was very quiet now, and it was the specific quiet of something extremely controlled. "Where's your wife?" "I told you, she went to..." "If you say she went to bed one more time," Adrian said, "I'm going to stop being polite about this conversation." Marcus's jaw tightened. He was calculating. She could see him doing it, the behind-the-eyes movement of a man running numbers, assessing, figuring out what he had to work with. He looked at Alara, at Adrian, at the door where Reyes had appeared in the frame of the entryway, which meant the back was covered, which meant Marcus had just figured out that he was not in the position he thought he was in. The calculation ended. His shoulders dropped a half-inch. "She's upstairs," he said. "She's fine. She panicked, and I..." He stopped. "We had an argument. I took her phone." Alara was up the stairs before he finished the sentence. Claire was in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with her arms wrapped around herself, still dressed, shoes still on, the posture of someone who had not been planning to sleep. She looked up when the door opened, and her face did something Alara recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror for 3 years. The rapid, complex reorganization of a woman who has been holding herself together by force of will and is suddenly looking at a reason to let go of it. "Alara." Her voice broke on the second syllable. Alara sat down next to her and put her arms around her, and Claire pressed her face into her shoulder and made a sound. A small, compressed, terrible sound, the kind that comes from a very deep place. And Alara held her and looked at the wall and breathed. "You're okay," Alara said. "I'm here. You're okay." "He took my phone," he said. Claire pulled back enough to look at her. Her eyes were dry, but barely. "He said you'd done something dangerous, that you'd gotten involved with someone dangerous, that I needed to stay in the house and not call anyone. He lied." "I know he was lying." Claire's jaw was set. "I've known something was wrong for 2 years. I didn't..." She stopped. Her eyes moved to the door. "Who's downstairs with him?" "Someone I trust." "You trust someone in..." "Claire." She took her sister's face in her hands, the way she used to do when they were children, and Claire was frightened of thunderstorms. "I need you to pack a bag. 10 minutes. The things that matter. Can you do that?" Claire looked at her for a long moment, then she nodded. Alara went back downstairs. The living room had rearranged itself in the 11 minutes she'd been gone. Marcus was sitting on the couch, and Reyes was in the armchair across from him, and Adrian was standing by the fireplace with his arms crossed, and the posture of someone who has been conducting a conversation that has yielded information. Marcus looked diminished. It was the only word for it, like something had been let out of him, some pressure that had been holding his shape. She looked at Adrian. He met her eyes and gave her the smallest nod. She read it as, "We have what we need." Or enough of it. "Marcus," she said. He looked up. "The financial documentation you built for Dragon's network," she said. "The architecture you designed 3 years ago. There's something embedded in it, something that exposes him personally. You know what I'm talking about." His face changed. "You didn't know it was there," she said, watching him. "You built it, and you didn't know. But it's there." He swallowed. "How do you..." "It doesn't matter how." She sat down in the chair across from him, where Reyes had been, and she leaned forward with her elbows on her knees. Her wrist was still sore where Graham had grabbed it 3 days ago. She could feel the ache of it, and she used it. Let it sit in her awareness like a compass needle pointing toward the reason she was in this room. "You have 2 options. You help us get that documentation extracted and delivered in a form that a federal attorney can use. Or you go down with Graham and Dragon when this comes apart. And it is coming apart, Marcus. Tonight. With or without you." He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze, and she did not look away. She thought about the woman upstairs packing a bag in 10 minutes. She thought about Graham sitting in a chair with her documents on the bed between them. She thought about 6 years of breathing carefully, of swallowing things, of making herself smaller and smaller to fit inside a space that kept contracting. She was done making herself smaller. "Okay," Marcus said. Adrian looked at her. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes on Marcus. "You're going to make some calls," she said. "Right now, tonight. You're going to give us access to every financial record you have from the last 3 years, everything. And then you and Claire are going to go somewhere safe. Not this house, not anywhere Graham knows about. And you are going to stay there until this is over." "And then what?" Marcus said. "What happens to me after?" "That depends on how useful you are in the next 2 hours," Adrian said from the fireplace. Marcus looked at him, then back at Alara. The calculation happened again behind his eyes, faster this time. The calculation of a man who has run out of other options and knows it. "My laptop's in the study," he said. They worked through it in 90 minutes. Marcus at his laptop, walking Adrian's man, a quiet, precise person who'd appeared from the follow vehicle and turned out to be some species of financial forensics specialist, through the architecture of the accounts, layer by layer, entity by entity. Alara sat on the periphery of it and watched and understood about 60% of what was happening and trusted Adrian's people to understand the rest. Claire came downstairs with a bag and stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her husband dismantle the structure he'd built for people who had never cared whether he lived or died. And her face was very still and very controlled, and Alara went to her and stood beside her and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that wasn't going to hurt regardless. At 12:54 in the morning, Adrian's forensics man looked up from the laptop and said, "Got it." Adrian looked at him. "All of it?" "The key piece, the personal exposure, the signatures, the account trails that go directly to Dragon. It's sufficient." Adrian exhaled, just barely. A controlled release of breath that told her how much tension had been sitting underneath the stillness. He looked at Alara. She looked back at him. She wanted to feel relief. She felt something more complicated. The way you feel when a thing you've been fighting toward finally arrives and you realize the fighting has changed you and you don't yet know the full shape of what you've become. The phone on the table rang. Not a cell phone. Marcus's landline, the one hardwired into the wall that nobody used anymore. It rang with that old-fashioned sound, mechanical, insistent, and everyone in the room went very still. Reyes looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at the phone. "Pick it up," he said to Marcus. Marcus picked up the phone. He listened for 4 seconds. His face went the color of old paper. He held the phone out to Adrian. "It's for you," he said. Adrian took the phone. He pressed it to his ear and said nothing. Just listened, his face doing that absolute stillness thing, no tells, no flickers. Then his eyes moved to Alara, just for a second, just a glance. But she'd learned to read him fast, and what she read in that glance made her blood go cold. "We'll be there," he said. He hung up. "That was Graham," he said. The room was silent. "He wants to meet," Adrian said. "In person, tonight." He paused. "He says if I don't bring Alara to the meeting location within the hour, he goes to a federal contact he has, someone inside a bureau office, a real contact, someone with authority, and he hands them everything he has on my organization. 10 years of it, real documentation, enough to dismantle everything I've built." He stopped. His voice was completely flat, informational. "He says he's had the file prepared for 3 months, a contingency for exactly this kind of situation. Nobody moved. Alara looked at him. "He's been building a file on you." "Yes." "For 3 months." "Yes." "Since before I contacted you." "Since before you contacted me." She understood then. The final piece of it, the thing that had been underneath everything, the reason Graham had not simply tightened the noose and waited. He hadn't been trying to keep her. He'd been using her. Using whatever she might do, whatever desperate move she might eventually make, as a tripwire to catch the man he'd identified as the most significant threat to his operation. She had been bait. She had been bait, and she hadn't known it, and Adrian hadn't known it, and all of this, her escape, his extraction, the compound, the board with the lines on it, had been moving inside Graham's plan the entire time. "He's going to use me to destroy you," she said. "He's going to try. And if you don't go, he releases the file. And if you do go?" He looked at her. The gray eyes were very steady. Then we finish it tonight, he said. All of it. One location, one conversation, everything on the table. That's not a meeting, she said. That's a trap. Yes. And you're considering walking into it. I'm considering my options. She stood up. She walked to him, close enough that she had to look up to hold his eyes. And she looked at him directly and she said, "Don't you dare make this decision without me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in him, some final held thing, shifted. "The meeting location he gave," he said quietly. "It's the Aldrich building, downtown. Decommissioned office tower, 12th floor." He paused. "He wants just you and me. No security." "He'll have security." "Of course he will." "And Dragon?" "Dragon's people will be close, not inside. Graham won't want witnesses to whatever he's planning, but close." She breathed in, breathed out. "What's on the 12th floor?" she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. The shadow of it. "Nothing. It's empty." So he picked a location where there are no witnesses, no cameras, no... Yes. "He's not planning to negotiate," she said. "No," Adrian said. "He's not." The room was very quiet. Reyes was looking at the floor. Marcus had his hands folded on the table and his eyes down. Claire was standing in the kitchen doorway with her bag at her feet and her arms crossed and her jaw set in a way that made her look, for one sharp moment, exactly like her sister. Alara looked at Adrian. "Tell me we have something," she said. "Tell me we have enough from what Marcus gave us. Enough that if we walk into that building and this goes wrong, it still gets out. It still reaches someone who can use it." He reached into his jacket and produced a drive. Small, black, the kind that fits in a closed fist. "Already transmitted to 3 separate secure drops," he said. "One is with a journalist I trust. One is with a federal attorney in a different jurisdiction from Graham's contact. One is with my own legal counsel in Vienna." He paused. "If something happens to me tonight, it all goes live simultaneously. Graham, Dragon, Marcus's architecture, all of it. It goes out regardless." She looked at the drive, at his hand holding it. "And if something happens to me," she said. He looked at her then, fully, completely, with something in his face she hadn't seen on him before, something that had no calculation in it, no strategy, nothing managed or controlled. Just a man looking at a woman in the particular way of someone who has realized, too late and at the worst possible moment, exactly what she means to him. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said. "That's not an answer." "I know." She held out her hand. He put the drive in it. She closed her fingers around it. "Let's go end this," she said. The car moved through the empty streets of Chicago at 1:17 in the morning, and the city was quiet and dark and enormous around them, and the Aldrich building rose ahead of them against the sky, its windows black, its bulk solid and waiting. And somewhere on the 12th floor of it, a man who had spent 6 years dismantling her was waiting with a plan he believed was airtight. And she sat in the back of the car with Adrian Kovar's shoulder 3 inches from hers, and the drive in her closed fist, and she was not afraid. She was something colder than afraid, something that had no name yet, but that she recognized as the final version of herself. The one that had been trying to get out for 3 years, the one that didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't make herself smaller. The one that Graham had spent 6 years trying to make impossible. The car stopped. Adrian looked at her. "Ready?" he said. She opened the door. "I've been ready," she said, "for 6 years." They walked towards the building and the dark swallowed them, and above them, 12 floors up, a light came on in a window. Just one, pale and cold, the light of a man who believed he had already won. And the lobby of the Aldrich building smelled like dust and old concrete, and the particular staleness of a space that had been sealed from the world for too long. The elevator was dead. They took the stairs. Adrian went first, Alara behind him. Reyes and one other man had taken positions on the ground floor despite Graham's no security demand, because Adrian Kovar had not survived 20 years in his world by honoring the rules of people who intended to kill him. The stairwell was dark, except for the beam of a single flashlight that Adrian held low, pointing at the steps, and their footsteps echoed off concrete in a way that made silence impossible. She counted floors by the numbers stenciled on each landing door. 8, 9, 10. She could hear her own breathing. She focused on it, counted it. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the rhythm she'd learned in the years of living with Graham when her own body had been the only thing she could control. Except now it wasn't fear driving the rhythm. It was something else. A cold, forward-leaning readiness that felt nothing like the woman who'd stood in a kitchen doorway with her hands clasped in front of her stomach and waited to be told what she'd done wrong. 11. 12. Adrian stopped at the door. He turned off the flashlight. In the dark, she could just make out the shape of him, the set of his shoulders, the deliberate stillness of a man reading a space through a closed door. He turned to look at her. She couldn't see his face clearly. She nodded. He pushed the door open. The 12th floor was one large open space, a gutted office floor, the kind that had been stripped to its bones during some renovation that never finished. Concrete pillars at intervals. The ghost marks on the floor where cubicle walls had been anchored. Windows along the eastern and western faces. And through the eastern windows, the city spread out below them, the lights of Chicago going on forever in every direction. Indifferent and beautiful and completely outside the reach of anything happening in this room. Graham was standing in the center of the space. He was not alone. Two men flanked him at a distance, positioned, not casual, the specific placement of hired security trying to look like they aren't. Graham himself looked exactly like Graham always looked. Composed, expensive, the suit unwrinkled despite the hour, his face arranged into the expression she'd spent 6 years reading, the one that communicated he was the most reasonable person in any room, and everything that had gone wrong was the result of someone else's failure to understand that. He looked at Alara first, then at Adrian, then back at Alara, and something moved across his face, something small and quickly controlled, but she saw it. She'd learned to see everything. It was surprise. She was not supposed to look like this. She was supposed to look frightened or diminished or uncertain. She was supposed to still be the woman he'd built. She was not that woman. "Graham," she said. Her voice came out flat and clear in the empty space. "Alara." He said her name the way he always had, with a slight downward inflection, like a period placed at the end of a sentence, like the name itself was a reminder that she was a thing with a fixed definition. "You look well." "Don't," she said. He blinked, the small recalibration of a man who expected a different opening. She let him recalibrate. Adrian had moved a half step to her right, not in front of her, not protecting her from view, beside her. A distinction that mattered, that she registered as precisely as she registered everything else in the room. "Mr. Kovar," Graham said, "I've heard a great deal about you." "I know," Adrian said. "You've been compiling it for 3 months. Graham smiled. It didn't reach anything. "Then you understand the position you're in." "Tell me how you see it," Adrian said. "Simple." Graham clasped his hands in front of him. The same gesture he used in boardrooms, the posture of a man explaining something to someone who should have understood it already. "You release Alara from whatever arrangement you've constructed. You withdraw your involvement from my affairs entirely, and in exchange, I don't hand a decade's worth of documentation on your organization to a federal bureau contact who is very motivated to use it. You walk away. Your operation survives."
You pause this.
"Alara comes home." The last 2 words were said with the same tone as everything else, matter-of-fact, reasonable, and they landed in the room like something that had gone bad. Alara felt them against her skin like cold air. "No," she said. Graham looked at her. "That's not on the table," she said. "None of it's on the table. You're not negotiating, Graham. You're performing. You've been performing this entire conversation." "Alara, the accounts!" She took 1 step forward. The concrete was solid under her feet. The city blazed through the windows behind Graham, and she kept her eyes on his face. "You froze the accounts to show me I had no options. The documents on the bed. You staged that to see how I'd react. The missing person report. That was you getting in front of a narrative you were already planning." She stopped. "You've been running a script. You've been running it since before I started planning to leave, because you knew before I did that I was going to. And everything you did, every move, it was designed to make sure that when I finally broke, I'd break in a direction you could control." Graham was very still. "The problem," she said, "is that the direction I broke was towards someone you couldn't control. And now you're standing in an empty building at 1 in the morning trying to run the same script on a man who writes different ones. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then Graham's left hand moved, a small, sideways gesture, barely visible, and the 2 men at his flank shifted. Not dramatically. A repositioning, a weight transfer. The specific movement of people who have received a signal and are executing it. Adrian moved faster than she could track, not toward Graham. Sideways, left, putting a concrete pillar between himself and the angle of the men repositioning. And he said one word, low and sharp, and the stairwell door behind them banged open, and Reyes came through it at a pace that made the room's geometry change completely. It wasn't a firefight. She'd half expected that, the explosive cinematic violence of it. But what it actually was over in under 90 seconds, and it looked nothing like the movies. Reyes took the nearer man before he'd completed the draw. The second man assessed the new arithmetic of the room. 2 people had become 4, and the advantage had inverted, and made the only intelligent decision available, which was to put his hands up and stop moving. Graham stood in the center of all of it, and for the first time in the 6 years she'd known him, he had no arrangement on his face. Nothing composed, nothing reasonable. Just a man standing in a room where his plan had run out, and the thing underneath the plan, the actual face, the one he'd spent decades not letting anyone see, was showing. He looked smaller. That was the thing she registered most. He looked like a smaller person than the one she'd been afraid of. "The file," he said. His voice had changed. "The documentation on Kovar, you understand that goes out automatically if something happens to me." "Interesting," Adrian said from beside the pillar. "I have the same arrangement." He reached into his jacket and held up a drive. Not the one he'd given Alara, another one. "Yours, actually. A copy of the file you built on me, extracted from your server by someone on your own IT team who was very persuadable." He paused. "Additionally, the financial documentation from Marcus Hale's system, the piece that exposes Dragan personally, went to a federal attorney in the Southern District of New York 40 minutes ago. Along with Graham Voss's name, his connection to Dragan's network, and a complete accounting of the financial crimes he's run through your jointly held corporate structures over the past 3 years. Adrian paused. "Both files went out, Graham, yours and mine. Yours just did more damage." Graham looked at the drive, then at Alara. She held his gaze. "It's over," she said. Not with satisfaction, not with cruelty. Just the statement of a fact that had become finally and completely true. Something went out of him then. She watched it happen. The extinguishing of whatever it was that had animated him, that particular quality of certainty that had always made him the most dangerous person in any room he occupied. It didn't collapse dramatically. It just dimmed, the way a screen goes dark. "You have nothing," he said. It came out quiet, and it came out like a man saying something he'd said to himself many times, and now could no longer make himself believe. "You've been saying that to me for 6 years," she said. "I think you need to update your information." He looked at the floor, at the ghost marks of the cubicle walls that had been here and were gone now. He looked like a man who was taking an inventory of everything he'd built and finding, for the first time, that none of it was real in the way he'd believed it was real. One of Graham's security men, the one who'd put his hands up, sat on the floor with his back against the wall and said nothing and looked at nobody. Reyes kept a position near the stairwell. The room had settled into the specific stillness of a situation that has resolved in a direction that nobody needs to announce. Adrian looked at Alara. She nodded once. "Someone will be in contact with your attorney," Adrian said to Graham. "The process will be what it will be. I'd suggest cooperating. The federal exposure is significant, and a demonstrated willingness to cooperate is the only variable you can still affect." He said it the way he said everything, without pleasure, without performance, just the delivery of accurate information to someone who needed it. "You'll want to be somewhere your attorney can reach you." Graham looked up. At Adrian, not at Alara. "Why?" he said. "Why does any of this matter to you? She's—" He stopped. Whatever he'd been about to say, he seemed to understand it would not land the way he intended. "This is not your fight." "No," Adrian said. "It's hers." He looked at Alara. "I'm just someone who showed up for it." She felt the word somewhere she didn't have a name for. She looked at the floor for 1 second, and then she looked up and she said, "Let's go." They left Graham standing in the gutted space with his hired security and the city lights behind him, and the weight of the next several years already settling on his shoulders. She did not look back. She'd done enough looking back. The stairs going down felt different from the stairs going up. She noticed everything: the texture of the handrail, the sound of their footsteps, the way the lobby opened up around them when they reached the ground floor, and the cold air of the street hit her face when they pushed through the exterior door. She stopped on the sidewalk. She just stopped and stood there and looked up. The sky above Chicago was not dark. It never was. In the city, the light pollution turned it a shade of orange-gray that blotted out everything except the brightest stars. She'd always found that sad when she was younger. Right now, it just looked like the sky over the place where her life was about to begin, doing something different. Adrian stopped beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask if she was okay. He just stood there on the sidewalk in the October cold and waited. She was understanding this more fully now, his specific language of respect. Not filling space, not performing concern, just being present and letting her have the moment without making it about anything. "The attorney," she said finally, "Tessa's friend. She has everything she needs. The divorce filing can happen this week. The criminal exposure gives Graham significant motivation to make the civil proceedings fast and clean." He paused. "You'll be entitled to more than you know. The financial structure of your marriage, the way he hid assets, the way he controlled accounts. It's documented now. Your attorney will have a clear picture." She thought about that. About the woman who'd stood in front of a bathroom mirror and not recognized herself. About the sketchbook she'd kept hidden. About the card tucked inside a book's spine for 8 months because some part of her had understood, before the rest of her was ready to, that she was going to need it. "Dragan," she said, "the documentation that went to the Southern District will move up the chain. It won't happen overnight. But Dragan's exposure in American jurisdictions is real now, and he knows it. His focus will be on damage control, not retaliation." Adrian paused. "He and I will have a conversation. A different kind than the one he was anticipating." "Is that safe?" He looked at her with the slight shift that was as close as he got to Rye. "Safer than the alternative." She absorbed that. "Marcus," she said, "he's cooperating. What happens to him is genuinely up to the legal process. His cooperation will matter." He paused. "Your sister will have options, real ones, whatever she decides." "She'll be okay," Alara said. It wasn't a question. It was a decision. The declaration of someone who has decided to believe something because the alternative is unworkable. "She's stronger than people think. She called you," Adrian said, at risk to herself. In the dark, whispering, "That's not a weak person." Alara looked at him. At the scar through his eyebrow and the city light catching the silver at his temples, and the face that had gotten more interesting than handsome, and that she had been reading with increasing accuracy for the past 36 hours. "You should have told me," she said, "about Dragan, about Marcus, when you knew." "Yes," he said, "no qualification, no defense." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the calculating quiet, the other kind, the one she'd learned to distinguish. That meant he was being honest with himself before being honest with her. "Because I didn't want you to decide not to move," he said. "Because you'd been not moving for 3 years, and I could see you finally getting ready to, and I made a decision about your risk tolerance without consulting you." He stopped. "It was wrong. I know it was wrong. You were protecting me." "I was controlling the variables," he said, "which is what I do, which is not the same thing as protecting someone. Not really." He looked at her directly. "You know the difference better than most people." She did know the difference. She knew it in her bones, in the specific scar tissue of 6 years. The difference between a hand that grabs a wrist and a hand that reaches to catch someone before they fall. The difference between managing and trusting. "Don't do it again," she said. "No," he said. "I won't." She believed him, not blindly. She didn't have blindness left in her. It had been used up. But with the particular belief of someone who has learned to read people accurately and is reading this one and finding underneath everything complicated and dangerous and morally uneven about him, a man who meant what he said. That would have to be enough. It was, she thought, more than she'd had in a very long time. "Where do I go now?" she said. Not helplessly, genuinely. The question of a woman taking stock of her own geography. "I don't have the apartment. I can't go back there." "No, I have—" She thought about it. "I have Tessa. I have Claire. Once Claire has somewhere to land, I have—" She stopped. She thought about the sketchbook, about the design work she'd let atrophy for 3 years because Graham had been slowly convincing her it wasn't worth doing, about the specific feeling of her hand moving on paper, the instinct of it, the thing that had survived everything because it was too deep to reach. "I have work to get back to," she said. "My own work. Things I stopped doing." "Bonitos mis stars, my mate." "Then start there," he said. Simply, like it was obvious. Like the answer to "where do I go" was always going to be back toward the thing you stopped doing when someone made you afraid. She looked at him for a long moment. "What happens to us?" she said. The question sat between them on the empty Chicago sidewalk at 2 in the morning. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out the way true things come out when you're tired enough that the editing mechanism stops working, directly, without the protective wrapping of indirection. He looked at her, and this time the shift in his expression wasn't slight. It was full, the full opening of something that a man like Adrian Kovar kept behind a great deal of architecture, and she understood what it had cost to build all that architecture, and she understood, looking at him, that she was one of approximately no people he'd let see behind it. "I don't know," he said. "I've spent 20 years knowing exactly what every situation was going to look like, what the exit was, what the cost was, how to price it." He stopped. "I don't know what this looks like." "Is that—" She almost smiled. Almost. "Is that frightening for you?" "Yes," he said, flat and honest and simple. "Good," she said. He looked at her. "It should cost something," she said. "Real things cost something. That's how you know they're real." He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "Yeah." She looked at the city, at all those lights, all those lives being lived, all those people awake and asleep and afraid and hopeful and somewhere in between. She thought about the woman she'd been 48 hours ago, sitting on the edge of a bed with a phone in her hand and her thumb over a send button, and she thought about everything that had happened between that moment and this one, and she thought, "I am not the same person." She wasn't sure yet who the new person was. That was okay. She had time to find out. For the first time in years, she had time. 3 weeks later, in a courtroom with afternoon light coming through the windows at a long, generous angle, a judge reviewed the documentation that had been assembled, the financial records, the account histories, the evidence of systematic control and asset concealment, and a man in an expensive suit sat at a table with his attorney and did not look up when the final terms were read aloud. Alara sat at the other table. Tessa's attorney friend, whose name was Dana Reyes, no relation to Adrian's Reyes, a coincidence that had made Tessa laugh when Alara pointed it out, sat beside her with the precise posture of a woman who had spent 20 years winning rooms through preparation rather than volume. She had known what she was doing with the documentation from the moment she received it. She had assembled something airtight in 10 days. The judge read the final terms. Graham signed. He signed with a pen that scratched across paper in the specific silence of a room where everyone was waiting for something to end. And when he put the pen down, he did not look at Alara, and she did not require him to. She didn't need the look. She didn't need the acknowledgement or the apology or the recognition. She had stopped needing things from him a long time ago, and the paperwork was simply the world catching up to a fact she'd already known. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon was cold and bright. The kind of October day that feels like the sky has been cleaned, all the color intensified, everything sharper at the edges. Tessa was waiting at the bottom of the steps, and when Alara came through the doors, Tessa looked at her face, and whatever she saw there made her exhale. A long, slow, complicated exhale that had years in it. They didn't say anything for a moment. They stood at the top of the courthouse steps, and they held each other, and the city moved around them, indifferent and continuous, the way cities are. "You okay?" Tessa said, into her shoulder. "I'm working on it," Alara said, which is different from not okay. Tessa pulled back and looked at her. "That's the most you've ever said." Alara laughed. It came out a little rough. She was still learning to let things come out without checking them first. But it was real. the realness of it surprising her slightly, the way it always surprises you when something you'd stopped doing turns out to still be possible. Claire was waiting at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse. She was sitting at a corner table with her hands around a cup, and she looked up when Alara walked in, and her face did the thing it had been doing since that night in the bedroom. The specific openness of someone who has stopped performing okay and is trying to figure out what they actually are underneath it. It was a familiar expression. Alara recognized it the way you recognize your own handwriting. She sat down across from her sister. They talked for 2 hours. About Marcus, who was cooperating, who was in a process that would take time to resolve, who Claire was facing with the kind of clear-headed devastation that is not the same as falling apart. About Claire's options, which were real ones, which Dana was already helping structure. About the house, which Claire would keep because the house was hers in ways the law would bear out. About what came next for both of them, which was genuinely unknown, which was, Alara said this and meant it, actually not the worst thing. The unknown was not the same as the void. The unknown was just space that hadn't been filled yet. Claire looked at her across the table and said, "You're different." "I know." "When did that happen?" Alara thought about it honestly. "I think it started 8 months ago," she said, "when I kept a card." She saw Adrian 2 weeks after the courthouse. He came to the studio she'd rented, a small space in a building on the west side, 4th floor, a room with good northern light and bare walls and the smell of fresh paint and the beginning of things. She'd been there for a week, setting it up the way she used to set up spaces before Graham had made her feel like the instinct for it was something to be embarrassed about. She had a drafting table and 3 plants she'd bought on impulse and a sketchbook that was already half filled. He knocked. She opened the door and he was standing there in a dark jacket in the hallway of an entirely ordinary building, and he looked, without the compound and the guards and the operational machinery around him, like a man who was slightly uncertain what to do with his hands. She stepped back to let him in. He stood in the middle of the studio and looked around it, at the drafting table, at the sketches pinned to the one wall she'd started using, at the plants, at the coffee maker that was older than it needed to be but worked. And she watched him look at it, and she could see him reading it, reading her, the way he read everything. "This is yours," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "Mine." He nodded. Something in his face settled, like he'd been checking on something and found it where it was supposed to be. He took a breath. Dragan agreed to terms. There are conditions, ongoing, monitored, but the immediate threat is contained. His exposure in American jurisdictions means he has significantly more to lose from escalation than from agreement. He paused. Graham's federal situation is in process. It will take years, but he has no remaining leverage. "Marcus," she said, cooperating fully. "What happens to him is genuinely uncertain, but he chose the right direction. That matters." He stopped. "Your sister is—" "She's okay," Alara said. "We talk every day. She's figuring it out." He nodded again. The studio was quiet around them. Through the window, the city did its continuous thing. The sound of it, the pulse of it, all those lives. The northern light came in clean and flat and good. She looked at him, at this man who had watched her from a distance for 8 months and made decisions she hadn't consented to, and also reached out a hand the moment it mattered, and also kept every promise he'd made her. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said on the sidewalk, about not knowing what this looks like." "Yeah, I don't know either," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not the same person I was 2 weeks ago, and I don't entirely know who I am yet, and anything that starts right now is going to be complicated by all of that." "I know," he said. "And you are," she said, "genuinely complicated. What you do, what you are, the world you live in. I'm not pretending that isn't real." "No," he said. "I wouldn't ask you to." She looked at him for a long moment. "But you showed up," she said. "When it mattered, you showed up. And you stood beside me, not in front of me. And when I told you not to make decisions for me again, you didn't argue." She stopped. "That's more than most people manage." He was very still, listening the way he listened, completely. "I'm not offering you certainty," she said. "I don't have any, but I'm—" She paused, found the right word. "I'm willing to see what it is, whatever it is." He looked at her, And the thing that moved across his face then was not the calculation and not the managing and not the practiced stillness of a man who had learned to keep everything behind glass. It was just a man who had spent 20 years building an empire in a world that ran on fear, and who had, somewhere along the way, forgotten that there were things that couldn't be acquired through the application of power. "Okay," he said, just that. "Okay." She thought it was probably the rightest thing he'd ever said to her. She went back to the drafting table, and he sat in the one chair she had, and she worked, and he sat, and the light moved across the room. The way light does in good northern studios, slowly, keeping pace with the afternoon, and neither of them needed to fill the space with anything other than what was already in it. Later, she would not be able to say exactly when things between them became what they became. There was no single moment she could point to. There was only the accumulation of ordinary time, the phone calls and the shared meals and the slow, careful business of two damaged people deciding to be honest with each other anyway. There were hard conversations and there were silences that weren't comfortable yet, but were getting there. There were nights when the fear came back, the old ambient fear, and she had to remind herself that it was a ghost and not the present. There were mornings when she stood at the studio window and looked at the city and felt, with a directness she was still getting used to, like someone who had a life that belonged to her. She worked. She worked the way she used to before she'd been slowly convinced that the work wasn't worth doing. She built a practice back from nothing, the same way you build anything back. One day, then another after that, until the accumulation of days becomes something that has weight and shape and goes on without requiring constant justification. She never forgot what she'd been afraid of. She didn't try to. Fear had been her companion for 6 years, and she knew its texture better than almost anything else, and she'd decided, consciously, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has paid for a lesson and intends to keep it, that knowing what fear feels like was not a weakness. It was a map. It told you, precisely and accurately, where the dangerous things were. The difference was that now she could look at the map and choose her route, instead of just being moved by the terrain. On a Tuesday in November, nearly 4 months after the night she'd walked out of her apartment in socked feet, with nothing but a phone and a book and a card tucked in its spine, she sat in a coffee shop with Tessa, and they drank coffee and talked about ordinary things. Tessa's new apartment, a project Alara was designing, the movie they'd seen over the weekend. And at some point Tessa looked at her over the rim of her cup and said, "You look like yourself." Alara considered it. "I'm getting there," she said. Tessa smiled. "Close enough." Outside the window, Chicago went about its business, enormous and indifferent and full of lives being lived in all their complications. She watched it for a moment. All those lights, all those people. She picked up her coffee. She was not the woman she'd been before. That woman was gone, and Alara had stopped grieving her because grieving implied the new version was lesser, and she didn't believe that anymore. What she was now was someone who had walked through something and come out the other side carrying the knowledge of exactly what she was made of. That knowledge was not comfortable. It was not the kind of thing that made life easier. But it was hers, completely, irrevocably, in a way that no one could freeze or confiscate or leave on a bed as a demonstration of power. It was hers. She finished her coffee. She went back to work, fade out.